You are listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96, and we are getting ready to speak with Dr. Gerald Horne. We just heard the Jazz Zone with Chien Providence, and he was playing a song with these hands. I don't know who was singing it, but sounded very good. I like that song. But Dr. Gerald Horne is the author of about 40 books, and one of his latest is Armed Struggle, Panthers and communists, black nationalists, and liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. And Dr. Horne has been a regular on this show for decades. And how are you feeling today, sir?
Oh, it's all good.
I'm going to let Melinda kick the show off.
Yeah, let's start with a theory of Black Canada and Africans in North America that you have been thinking about and researching.
Well, I've been thinking about it a lot because, as you know, I'm in Victoria, British Columbia, and have been here for some time now. And when I go into stores, clerks don't follow me around, and it makes me nervous, which is, of course, that's what happens when I go into a store in the United States. And I've been tempted to ask some of these clerks, aren't you going to lose your white supremacy card if you don't follow me around? I mean, what's wrong with you? And obviously, I've been thinking about the difference between how I'm treated in Canada versus how I'm treated south of the border in the United States of America. And as oftentimes happens, the simplest explanation is probably the most appropriate explanation. What I mean by that is that the United States is a post-slavery society, and slavery continues to haunt the descendants of the enslaved in the United States of America. Whereas in Canada, at least in British Columbia, and let me issue this footnote, is that I'm only speaking about British Columbia. I'm not sure if what I'm saying is relevant to Ontario, for example, or relevant to Quebec, or even Nova Scotia, for that matter. But in British Columbia, on the Pacific coast, there has been an influx of Black people with the gold rush of the late 1850s. And in fact, as you probably know, the Black population of San Francisco moved en masse to British Columbia during that time. And they were settlers. They were not necessarily, they were not the descendants of enslaved Africans. And in fact, the first settler killed in South Spring Island, which is, of course, part of British Columbia, this took place in 1868, was in fact a Negro who was battling the indigenous. In other words, not to put too fine a point on it, in British Columbia, a person like myself who speaks, I am told, with a U.S. accent, and we should reference here the fact that British Columbia, as its name suggests, was a former colonial possession of Great Britain, and anybody who knows beans about Great Britain knows that accent discrimination is part of the culture. That even leads to people trying to change their accent to be accepted into a higher class, for example. And given the fact of this aforementioned history, Black people being settlers, not necessarily the descendants of enslaved Africans on this soil, and given an accent of a person like myself, that helps to shed light on the difference. And indeed, as I pointed out before, and as is well known, the founding father of British Columbia, Sir James Douglas, was a man of African descent, and in fact was married to a woman who was of Cree ancestry, at least partially, that is to say, indigenous ancestry. And so let me first of all say there's no such thing as kinder and gentler capitalism or colonialism, but it's also fair to say that there are differences between Swedish and Scandinavian capitalism and the dog-eat-dog capitalism of the United States. For example, labor union density, the number of workers who are in unions are much higher in Sweden than the United States of America, which helps to explain why social welfare benefits are much more developed in Sweden than in the United States of America. And then there's the difference between those who colonized Canada and the settlers who colonized what is now the United States of America. That is to say that the settlers who were sent to this part of Canada were oftentimes dispatched by the Hudson Bay Company, which has, as you know, a 355-year history. The descendant of that company is now going out of business, which is quite a historic turning point for Canada. And the Hudson Bay Company was heavily involved in the fur trade. That's one of the reasons why the beaver still exists as a symbol of Canada. And a turning point with regard to the settling of Europeans just across the border in what is now the state of Washington, particularly Seattle, is that in 1856, this is relevant to the United States today, Governor Isaac Stevens declared martial law and detained the Chief Justice and a number of other fellow leaders. Why, you ask? Well, the settlers were split. The Chief Justice and those around him were perceived as following the British and French model. They were intermarrying, for example, with indigenous women, such as Sir James Douglas had intermarried with a woman of Cree ancestry. And the dominant hegemonic faction under Governor Stevens felt that that was jeopardizing the security of the settlements. They felt that they could not take the Native Americans' land as long as fellow elites were intermarrying with Native American women. Just like in the state of Texas, as I point out in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, there was a split between those who wanted to liquidate the indigenous and those who wanted to put them on reservations. And the former faction prevailed. And so I think it's also fair to say that what happened subsequently is that the triumphant faction who are against intermarriage, and of course they subsequently passed a number of laws forbidding intermarriage, and I don't think you can begin to understand the hostility to intermarriage even to this very day in the United States of America without understanding this back history and this backstory. They began to import Euro-American women from the East Coast so that these men did not have to mate with Native American women. Interestingly enough, they did allow bordellos and brothels where Native American women were, quote, servicing, unquote, these settlers. And in fact, as I point out in my upcoming book in Washington, D.C., the wealthiest woman in antebellum, pre-Civil War Washington, D.C. of African descent was a Black woman who ran a bordello in Washington, D.C., interestingly enough. And indeed, that story of importing women of European ancestry to the state of Washington then became the subject of a hit television show in the United States in the 1960s called Here Come the Brides, where they sort of romanticized this particular episode. Also on this question of intermarriage, as you probably know, living in Canada, the man who has probably received the most attention in terms of historians in Canada, just like Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln has received the most attention of any individual in U.S. history, is Louis Riel, who was Métis. Métis is a designation not unlike, quote, colored, unquote, in South Africa, designating those of French ancestry and indigenous ancestry. And indeed, the execution of Louis Riel in the 1840s still haunts the French-speaking population of Canada. And of course, he was in Manitoba. And so just to conclude, a person like myself here in British Columbia is viewed as a fellow settler, as the same class, so to speak, despite my ebony hue. Whereas in the United States, I am viewed as of a different class, that is to say, descendants of the enslaved and of a different hue. And interestingly enough, in Canada, the indigenous are 4% of the population, 25% of the enslaved. And what this leads me to conclude, is that many of our friends, Black friends in British Columbia, they tend to celebrate the Black history of British Columbia, you know, Sir James Douglas, founding father, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there needs to be a peace offering of reconciliation to the indigenous, to apologize for the Black role in indigenous dispossession and its forging settler colonialism here in British Columbia.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. I remember when I came to Canada, Marvin X Jockman. Many people know who Marvin X is. He's out of San Francisco. We came up here at the same time, and we used to walk into rooms, and people heard us talk, and it was like we may as well have been Eddie Kendricks and David Ruffin, and you know, they were tempted. They loved the accent, but I think it didn't have too much about our matinee idol looks, because we were average, you know, in terms of, we're not bad looking, but I think it was because the Africans in America were struggling. I think that when you fight against the oppression, I think that is, as your man Henry Kissinger would say, I think that's a hell of an aphrodisiac.
Well, let me add another point in all fairness, which is that, as you know, part of Canadian culture, which is really flowering nowadays in the run-up to the April 28th elections, is that they are proud of not being like the United States of America. In 1776, the settlers here were asked to join the revolt against British rule. They said no. In 2025, they are asked or demanded by Mr. Trump that they join the United States, and they say hell no. And perhaps part of what I perceive in terms of how I'm treated in British Columbia is that the folks here are trying to distinguish themselves once more from their neighbors south of the border. That is to say, we know that if you go into a store in the United States, Gerald Horne, you'll be followed around like you're a criminal about to shoplift. And we're distinguishing ourselves from those barbarians due south by not doing so. Whatever the case, another wider point that I should mention is that I think that those who came before us in the radical and progressive movement, they made many landmark revelations about the nature of the United States of America. But to a certain extent, I think they fell down on the job when it comes to a fundamental understanding of settler colonialism, a term which they generally did not use. They fundamentally fell down on the job with regard to understanding the Negro question quite broadly, a term that they did use. And they certainly did not necessarily understand the class question with regard to slavery, which they tended to view as a, quote, exclusively, quote, race question, unquote. And I think that that's one of the many reasons why we're now staring down the barrel of fascism.
Well, could I say that I think that it's according to where, you know, where the struggle is at that particular time. If, like I say, we're fighting back, I think people respond to you better. But at the same time, I remember I went into the hospital one time and I had a wisdom tooth taken out, and there was a sister, Caribbean sister, was the nurse, and she jumped on me because she said, you know, you're pretending like you're a Yankee. You basically told me I was faking the funk, you know, and because she thought I was, trying to pretend that I was a Yankee. But,
because of your accent, or what was she pointing to?
Because of my accent. She was basically saying that I was a West Indian, but I was trying to make a move on her. So I was trying to use the fact that I was a Yankee to get, to as an aphrodisiac,
I see.
I was saying, the African American at one point were supposedly, it had a lot to do with, we were supposed to have money, you know what I mean, in terms of as African people. That had a lot to do with it, not with Hollywood, not, you know exactly what I'm saying.
I see.
And you're listening to Diasporic music. So when we talk about I want to talk about Gabon. Could you talk about the elections in Gabon?
Well, sure. As you know, some months ago, there was an overthrow of the Bongo dynasty that had been in place for a half century or more by a military coup. Many had suspected that it would be like the other changes of government in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and the Sahel, where more or less progressive military officers came into power. But alas, that has not been the case in Gabon. The winner of this election, Mr. Nguema, won apparently 90% of the vote, at least that's what we were told. He apparently is a property owner in the state of Maryland, so he can make a quick exit if need be. And the events in Gabon, oil-rich, 2.3 million population, still seems to be an example of French neocolonialism. But if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to this trade war, because this trade war is spinning out of control. On the one hand, you have China, which has, by even the accounts in the bourgeois press, I'm thinking of a recent article in Foreign Affairs, the elite journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, that they have escalatory dominance. That is to say that they can continue escalating, just like Russia has escalatory dominance with the war in Ukraine. That is to say that they don't necessarily have to buy Boeing airplanes. They can buy Airbus airplanes. About to be unveiled is a Chinese version of the jumbo jet manufactured by the Chinese corporation Comac. They can get agricultural foodstuffs from Brazil. They can get films, not only from Hollywood, and of course the transmission of films across the Pacific have been suspended. They can get them from India, Spain, Nigeria, South Africa. They can diversify their cinematic diet. Whereas the United States has difficulty in replacing the exports from China. That's one of the reasons why Mr. Trump lifted tariffs almost instantaneously on electronic goods from China, which is about 40 to 50% of the exports. Apple, the multi-trillion-dollar corporation, is heavily dependent upon manufacturing in China, and it will not be an easy thing to replace that with workers in Vietnam nor India. So China has escalatory dominance, which does not bode well for the fortunes of U.S. imperialism, which is one of the reasons why you see a lot of the investor class pulling their money out of the United States. The dollar is weakening, etc. The telltale sign, as we said last week, was the fact that it's costing the United States government more to borrow money. They have to pay more in terms of interest on treasury bills, because the central banks in Japan and China, who are major purchasers of these treasury bills, are beginning to sour. Mr. Trump's erratic behavior leads some to conclude that that could extend to confiscating the assets of China in the United States of America, since he's so unpredictable and since he does not necessarily observe the rule of law, as exemplified by his thumbing his nose at court decisions concerning the return to Maryland of the man of Salvadorian ancestry, speaking of Kilmore Abrego Garcia, for example. But on the other hand, the United States is on an escalation ladder. What I mean by that is that they're not backing down. As a matter of fact, they keep raising the ante. The latest maneuver is the equivalent of secondary sanctions. What I mean by that is they're going to third countries, for example, Japan, for example, Italy, and saying that if you engage in a kind of blockade or embargo of China, just like the embargo and blockade of Cuba, then you will be benefited by reduced tariffs on your exports to the United States of America. However, if you continue your relationship with China, then you will have to endure higher tariffs. What I'm afraid of, but what I think is a possibility, is that the United States will try to execute some sort of false flag maneuver in Taiwan, the rebel island off the southern coast of China that China claims as its own, which also happens to house TSMC, which is a major manufacturer of these super chips, which are difficult to manufacture elsewhere. And that this false flag operation will then allow the United States an excuse for engaging in military conflict with China, although we know, as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has announced most recently, that in war games, routinely, China prevails in terms of a toe-to-toe match with the forces of U.S. imperialism. In other words, I think Mr. Trump has not only painted himself, he's painted this country into a corner with no easy exit. The problem for many of us, and fortunately, well, hopefully, since I'm not in the United States right now, this will not necessarily harm me personally. But for 330, 340 million people in the United States, they're on a ship with an erratic captain at the controls who's heading for an iceberg. And instead of going in reverse, he's putting the pedal to the metal and saying full speed ahead. This is a very ominous and dangerous development.
He's putting the pedal to the metal, as Charlie Wilson would say, huh?
I'm afraid so. It's quite dangerous right now, because what's at stake is not only, as some have put it, and interestingly, I've been monitoring the international press, Deutsche Welle, France 24, Channel 4 in Britain, media in Turkey, Al Jazeera, etc. And they're just replete with stories about how the world is going through this great transition with China surpassing US imperialism. Now, this is no minor thing. Number one, you have, despite all of this rhetoric about the death of communist parties post-1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that means that a country ruled by a communist party is surging to the forefront, despite what we have been instructed about white supremacy. You have a country of Asian ancestry surging to the forefront. To a certain extent, this brings back memories that some would like to forget of an 1,000-year history going back to the man we call Genghis Khan and his lineal descendants who reached the gates of Hungary. And in fact, if you look at the faces of certain Hungarians, you can still see the imprint of these Mongolians who thundered out of East Asia, what we call East Asia, 1,000 years ago, and as I said, reached into Eastern Europe. And so this is not a minor turning point. This is not like the United States surpassing Britain post-1945. This is a horse of a different color. And this is one of the many reasons I suspect that there's so much hysteria right now in the United States of America, because this is not a normal changing of the guard. This is something altogether unique and different.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. But the I guess the white supremacists are scared to death, living not in a biblical sense, but I guess we are living in the last days of imperialism.
Well, it's going to be tricky. As I pointed out elsewhere, during the Cold War I, the Soviet Union was supporting national liberation movements in Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, which was putting pressure on U.S. imperialism to retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. But now, with Cold War II, you see that the rulers and the Euro-American majority are moving in an opposing direction. They're opposed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is to say that they think that white privilege should be reinforced, if not reified, which of course allows for the ascendancy of a lot of incompetence, such as Pete Hegseth, the former Fox News host at the Pentagon, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the vaccine denialist, head of U.S. healthcare, a doggone Kristi Noem, who likes to appear on social media and television with expensive Rolex watches and various accoutrements of that sort as head of Homeland Security. And so this is only complicating and exacerbating the crisis, this polycrisis, this crisis of multiplicity. What I'm saying is that with regard to the attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, even those we had thought were friends, such as Senator Bernie Sanders, the titular leader of the U.S. left, is opposed to DEI. He says it complicates the class question. He's been joined by others of that stripe, such as the leaders of these estimable journals, such as Jacobin and The Nation. So there was reason in the 1950s and 1960s for the opportunists in Black America to say, well, we may have thrown Paul Robeson and his comrades overboard, but at least we're seeing the easing of Jim Crow. Yet in 2025, we are now ideologically bereft because of that momentous decision at a time when the white supremacists are becoming ever more hysterical and are about to toss many of us overboard. And of course, the latest move on the immigration front is the attempt to overthrow birthright citizenship, this idea that if you're born in the United States, then you are a U.S. national. That was enacted post-U.S. Civil War in order to normalize the citizenship of Black people. So if you overthrow birthright citizenship, does that mean that the normalizing of citizenship of Black Americans is also up for grabs? And in that regard, our folks who are Jamaican American, Trinidadian American, et cetera, the next move is to denaturalize. That is to say, if you got your citizenship through paperwork, then they're going to go back and look at your paperwork, and by means mostly foul, certainly unfair, they're going to denaturalize you and send you back to Jamaica, send you back to Trinidad. I don't think that many in the United States are ready for these dramatic and huge and gigantic changes that are in store.
So that would mean that someone like Kwame Ture, if he were alive today, he was born, I think he spent the first 12 years of his life in Trinidad, but then the rest of his life, or part of his life, was in the United States. Someone like him, he could be deported. That's what they're trying to bring back, right?
That's what denaturalization would mean. I think it. And see, I think that these crises are interlinked. That is to say, as the crisis with China becomes ever more pronounced, Mr. Trump will seek, like a magician. You know, a magician, he wants you to look to the right as he pulls off a trick on the left. So he wants to distract your attention, which is obviously euphemistic, by moving on these other fronts, such as denaturalization, for example. I think that it's been whispered in the corridors of power in Washington. It's in store. It would complement, quote unquote, the sending of U.S. nationals to prisons in El Salvador, which Mr. Trump has also raised, by the way. This case of Mr. Abrego Garcia is just an opening gambit with regard to sending U.S. nationals, or as Mr. Trump says, homegrowns, unquote, to prisons outside of the United States. In fact, given the prospect of being sent back to your homeland or Jamaica or Trinidad, as opposed to being sent to a hellhole of a prison in El Salvador, you might choose the former.
I think we have run out of time, sir.
Good luck to you.
All right. And I would like to thank my good friend Elisa Watson for keeping us on track today. And Melinda Francis, you have anything else to add?
Yeah, hope that the listeners stay safe through till next Sunday, and we'll see everybody in the whirlwind.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.